some things to think about if you're experiencing OCD. Now, I noticed that ASMR actually helps me a lot with OCD because it gets me to calm down, for one. What we're going to start with here is we're going to start with just using some Vaseline, some moisturizing stuff on my hands. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I wash my hands a ton. It's actually a little bit of a recent development. I used to not wash my hands all the time, but I noticed that I was afraid of contaminating other things. Now, I don't want to share this OCD trigger with other people, so I want to talk about this first and foremost as an example for everything else I talk about. There's no point in washing your hands over and over again. There's just not. Your hands are clean if you thoroughly scrub them with soap and water the first time. Now, why do I bring that up? Something that's personal to me when it comes to OCD, but may not be personal to you. Well, basically all other triggers are the exact same. They're the exact same as washing your hands too many times. Now, whether you're checking the oven at night, whether you're checking for the third time to make sure your door is locked or anything like that, OCD is not preying on your fears, right? It might seem like it is, but really it's preying on your concerns because you care, right? These intrusive thoughts wouldn't bother you if you were emotionally lazy, and these intrusive thoughts wouldn't bother you if you didn't care. So really, I would argue it's an anxiety disorder caused by caring. And you're going to get in these hills and valleys. You can have days where your OCD doesn't seem so bad, and OCD can seem really bad on other days. But I particularly want to talk about what you can do to avoid having triggers for OCD, how you can avoid committing to compulsions. And I would say that the reason that I feel okay with talking about what you can do is because I've personally had OCD. I don't know, probably my whole life, but I know I started to notice it when I was around 8 years old or so. I hated it. I've always hated it, to be fair. I think everybody with OCD says mentally how much they hate it on a daily basis, but we're going to get you past that today. Or if you need to rewatch this video, go for it. We're going to get you past this, and me past this, over the course of many videos, probably. I would love to post a guided meditation for OCD, but that's enough rambling. Let's get into what you can actually do. So here are some methods for attempting to make things better for your OCD. I'm going to walk in a little bit here. But the first thing that I would recommend doing is trying to introduce logic into your trigger, you know? So let's just throw something out there that's random. Let's say something super common. You're afraid of leaving the oven on when you leave the house. Maybe when you're going on vacation or when you're just going to bed for the night, you know? Now, where does that come from? And do you often leave the stove running? Have you ever left the stove running? Probably not. Probably not. And if you have, it's understandable, right? It's understandable. But there's always logic that you can introduce, right? You can look at the stovetop necessarily following through, well, not at all following through with your intrusive thought. That's really non-existent. We all know that. If you have an intrusive thought like, oh my god, what if I said something terrible? That's just not true. You didn't. You'd be more worried about having said it than wondering if you said it. That's how it works. That's how intrusive thoughts work. But exposure therapy, I don't want to mention any new triggers now at this point, so exposure therapy, let's say, do something like leaving the oven on, which we mentioned a couple times. That's a pretty universal one in my opinion. Exposure therapy would be checking once. We'll get each individual knob or button or whatever, and just check once. Walk away and realize, hey, if any of these were turned to the side, if any of these were on, my alarms would have gone off in my head, and I would have just simply turned them off. There's absolutely no shot that you take a look at your oven, and one of your burners is on, and then you walk away. You have OCD. You wouldn't do that. You just simply wouldn't do that. So the exposure therapy there, sometimes you have to check a second time just to be sure. Double checking. It's a word, it's a phrase for a reason. You can double check. That's okay. And you can say to yourself, I'm just double checking. I'm not giving in to this intrusive thought of what if the oven's on. I'm just double checking. I'm just double checking. But you absolutely cannot take a look at your oven twice and still be wrong. And still be wrong about it being off or on. The exposure therapy there is that you continue to walk away and you think to yourself, hey, I walked away the first time. Why did I walk away the first time? Because you were already subconsciously confident that the oven was not on. You were able to walk away the first time for a reason. You would not walk away from an oven that is on. It's not in your soul. It's not in your mind to do that. So exposure therapy is very important. Exposure therapy is, you can double check, but after that, walk away. Exposure therapy is simply, most of the time, just walking away from the intrusive thought altogether. Or, like I mentioned earlier, exposure therapy is washing your hands once. There's no double checking when you're washing your hands. You wash your hands once. And the exposure therapy is walk away. Right? There's more extreme forms of OCD, and that's what affects people the most, is the more extreme intrusive thoughts. Go ahead and try and use this logic for your tougher intrusive thoughts as well. Kind of being like, you have this intrusive thought, if you're at the store, and you're like, what if blank happens? It's hard to incorporate exposure therapy in a moment like that, but the exposure therapy would just be like, you're wrong, OCD. You're totally wrong. You're totally wrong, and move on. That's so hard to do, but the more you're able to do that, the easier it will become. Exposure therapy can happen in many, many ways. I would never, ever tell somebody with OCD to use exposure therapy to follow through with their intrusive thought. That's something that you wouldn't do. That's why it's an intrusive thought. So, exposure therapy is ignorance of the intrusive thought. I saw a video that was like, this lady left a makeup bag on the top of her toilet. Not on the toilet seat, but on the top of the back part, the back console. I don't know what the heck it's called. And she was like, I have contamination OCD. So my roommate put my makeup bag on the toilet. Now I feel like I have to throw away my makeup bag. And the comments were like, this is a perfect time for exposure therapy. If you need to, just wipe off the bottom with like a disinfecting wipe if you need to. But you're totally good. That's why your makeup is in a bag, to protect your makeup. So at that point, the exposure therapy would be taking it, setting it on the counter, and realizing Now, this type of video is not going to help you all the time if you're experiencing OCD, but a meditation video, probably would. So, as far as I'm concerned, meditation is an amazing practice. I mentioned earlier, you have the ability to shut off your mind. You have the ability to watch as these thoughts pass you by, and they can be anything. They can be absolutely anything at all. And instead of focusing on those thoughts, instead of giving in to the anxieties that any thoughts might cause you, you just acknowledge it. If it's an intrusive thought, you can mentally say, I acknowledge that I just had an intrusive thought, and I'm just going to let it pass me by. That's powerful. That's really helpful. But specifically when it comes to meditation, you start to realize that in your daily life, you start to be able to allow intrusive thoughts to pass you by even when you're not in a meditative state. Meditation is simply